Nick Griffin, North West MEP Party Chairman, has come to join us and speak for us. So a big welcome from Liverpool for Nick.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. Good to see so many people here, some new faces as well as old ones. I'm going to talk today specifically about one subject, but before I do, especially for the new people, I want to touch on a few things, because you come to a British National Party, you're probably expected to hear something about immigration. So very briefly, here's the immigration points. Britain is full, it's time to shut the door. And for the ones who are here, another simple message: this is Britain, this is our country, you do it our way, you love this country, or there's the door. You might have come here to connect it perhaps to immigration, but other issues as well, to ask, what's the British National Party going to do about jobs? Millions of people in this country of ours unemployed. And when you look at how they boast, we've created so many new jobs over the last few years, you look at those new jobs. They're not in manufacturing, they're not in construction, they're mainly in shops, and they're part-time jobs, and they're low-paid jobs, and they're jobs on zero-hour contracts, which means there's no decent money, there's no security, you can't raise a family, you can't build a future on jobs like that. This country desperately needs proper jobs, making things that the world wants to buy to make the money which can help one of the most overcrowded parts of the world support its population. That needs doing. It could be doing. Could be done. We're absolutely committed as a party to rebuilding British industry. When we say British jobs to British workers, first of all, we mean that no foreigner gets a job in this country while there's a Brit who needs and can do that job. That's the first point. But secondly, we also are saying we need to rebuild Britain's manufacturing base. We need to stop, for instance, having ambulances that are built in Germany, police cars that are built in Sweden. What the hell is wrong with using our tax money to buy things which are made in this country by British workers, starting with things like ambulances and police cars and all the rest of it? And that we're absolutely committed to do, because we're British nationalists. It means that we recognise, first of all, the very first job of a British government is to run the affairs of this country in the interests of all the British people, and not in the interests of a handful of people who happen to have enough money to make it worth their while closing down factories in Britain and shipping into the Far East, because that makes them more profits. That we would stop. When we say British jobs for British workers, it's not just about stopping Polish plumbers, though we would stop Polish plumbers. It's also about rebuilding the whole of Britain's economy around the basis of looking after Britain and British interests first. And that we're going to do. People might ask, well, how are you going to pay for it? I'm not going to go into that today, but I'll tell you very simply that it's now cost Britain, a rough estimate, something like £400 billion to bail out the banks. That's bailing out useless, corrupt, crooked banks from the consequences of their own stupidity and their own greed, when they should have been allowed to go to the wall. The government should have picked up the pieces, and that money instead, imagine £400 billion put into rebuilding British industry, put into research and development. This country still develops a huge proportion of the inventions in the world, and we invent them. But do you see the factories and the skilled jobs turning those inventions into concrete, real, decent products the world wants to buy in this country? No, you don't. They end up in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, America, everywhere else in the rest of the world, because the rest of the world comes in and steals the idea, in effect steals the jobs. Imagine £400 billion being invested into British research and development, British training, British manufacturing, British industry, the British economy. This country will again lead the world, but no one else is going to do it, because every single one of the other parties says, oh, we believe in free trade, we believe in an international economy. This party does not. We believe in putting our own people first. Or people might wonder, someone new, well, what would we say, for instance, about the fact that in the news the last few days you've had the obscene cost of a public inquiry where Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, can snivel and whine on about he should be allowed to go to a different kind of hospital. What would we do about him? It wouldn't be in the news, because if we had our way, what the vast majority of the British people want, at least 70%, would be capital punishment for creatures like Brady. He would have hung back in the 1960s. We wouldn't have to spend a penny looking after him. People might ask, well, what about all these wars that Britain gets involved in? I've got a note here. The cost of the Iraq War to Britain, £4.5 billion. To turn Iraq from a harmless socialist basket case, which wasn't going to do us any damage, into a howling wilderness of Islamist terrorism. £4.5 billion that cost this country. The overall cost for Britain and America, with the Americans fortunately paying the lion's share of it, of the Iraq and the Afghan war, is estimated it's going to end up, when they paid all the pensions for the lads who come home with no arms, no legs and all the rest of it, when it's all done and dusted, when all the wear and tear and all the military equipment is replaced, it's going to cost the Yanks and us together a staggering $6 trillion. Those two wars which have made the world a less safe place. What's our message on these wars? It's very simple, that we're not a pacifist party. The British National Party believes passionately that our armed forces are still man for man and woman for woman the best in the world. They should stay that way. To do that, we need to invest money in them. We need to put money into training. We need to make sure that if they do go out to fight a war, they're not sent out in Land Rovers which are death traps. They're sent out properly equipped as well as properly trained. And when they come home, they're housed in decent places. And when they leave the army, they're looked after properly. We're passionate about spending more money on Britain's armed forces, so that if, for instance, the Argentinians again try and take the Falklands, we would go to war to maintain the right of the 2,000 people living in the Falklands to be British, because they are British. They're absolutely of our stock. They're our people. On top of that, although the water around there is deep and it's rough and it's cold, there's vast amounts of oil underneath and around the Falklands. That's oil that Britain will one day need to pay for our health service, to pay for our defence forces, to pay for all these things, to pay for our pensions in an ageing population. So we would be prepared to go to war, but only properly equipped to defend the Falkland Islands. But when we see these crazy wars they get us into and try and get us into, we have to spend all that money in Afghanistan. £20 billion it will have cost Britain to go into Afghanistan by the time we leave. £20 billion is what it's going to cost. What the hell for? All sorts of different stories. To stop terrorism, it was at one stage, and then it was to make sure that Afghan girls can get a good education and aren't forced to wear the burqa. Now, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that girls should have an education absolutely as good as that the boys get. I've got 3 daughters. Of course I have. But how the Afghans look after their affairs is up to the Afghans, and it's not up to us. And not 20 billion. This party wouldn't have spent £1, let alone the life of one British serviceman, to do anything on behalf of the Afghans, because it's their fight, it's their job, it's our economy. We should be looking after our own people here in Britain and keep out of wars that have nothing to do with this country. Absolutely. Perhaps one final point, the European Union. There's David Cameron and the Tories now half-heartedly trying to push through Parliament's a law which would give us a referendum on Europe, in or out, in 2017. What a crock. We could have a referendum in 4 months' time if Cameron actually wanted it. All he's got to say is, I'm going to dissolve Parliament, because we haven't got a functioning government. We're dissolving Parliament. We're going to the country on this one question: do we or do we not have a referendum in Europe? If we win, we guarantee you one 2 months afterwards. Could be done as easy as that. Cameron's not going to do it because he doesn't want to do it. Just like all the previous Tory Prime Ministers, from Heath, who took us in, from Thatcher, who signed up to Maastricht, an ever greater union, through Major and all the rest of them, and then Blair and Brown. The whole of the British political elite wants us in Europe. not least because they're bought and paid for to do it. So therefore we'll never get a proper referendum. I know there's a few faces here old enough to remember the 1975 referendum. I was involved in that campaign as a young activist, campaigning no, get Britain out. And they say, well, we had a fair referendum. We did not have a fair referendum. You may remember that every house got booklets for and against. But every house got one booklet, the case for, one booklet, the case against, and one booklet, what the government says. And the government said, yes, let's go in. So in other words, every house got 2 booklets for and 1 booklet against. As I say, I was involved in that campaign, and the no campaigners, for every pound that the no campaign had to spend, the yes campaign had £11 to spend, because big business were backing them. What kind of democracy is it where one side in a vote, where the question is rigged in the first place, one side have 11 times more to spend on propaganda than the other side had to spend on their publicity? And that's what we'll get the next time around. So with the British National Party, I tell you this, although we've campaigned and still campaign for the referendum that we were promised before the last election by Cameron, if we won an election, there would be no referendum. We would simply get Britain out. So having done that whistle-stop tour around some key British national parties, I'm going to talk about one thing, and that is the issue of Syria, where, as you probably know, you certainly should know, David Cameron, William Hague, the whole of the British political elite are determined to drag people in to another crazy foreign war. I'm going to speak about it at some length. I'm going to explain what's going on and why it matters to us here in Liverpool. Before I do that, I just want to mention that no one else in British politics does this, because British politics is dumbed down, because the British political elite and the British media treat the British people as stupid. And they would say, right, this is basically a working class audience in a working class part of Liverpool. We're just going to talk about sound bites and a few slogans, and that's it, because people are too stupid to take anything in. I do not believe that. I don't believe it for 1 minute. And I believe the British people have the ability and the knowledge and the brains and the common sense to make up their own minds on really important issues, if we're only given the facts on really important issues. As you know, this is being televised by bnptv, so it's not just for you, it's a much wider audience. This speech will go out to thousands and thousands of people over the next few weeks alone. So I'm going to talk some serious politics, some serious facts, because I believe it's time the British people were treated like adults, were given the serious facts, instead of being treated like little kids and lied to and deceived and cheated by the ruling elite. This party does something differently, does these things differently, so that's what I'm going to do. First of all then, why does Syria matter to Britain? It's a long way away. I've just said we should stay out of other people's quarrels, so why talk about Syria? Well, for the first point, it's because there's already British soldiers involved on the ground. It's hidden and it's concealed, but there's British soldiers on exercises in Jordan, just next door, who are training Syrian rebels. The people who in the last few weeks have executed a 15-year-old boy for saying to someone who asked him for a free cup of coffee in his shop, I wouldn't give you a free cup of coffee if Mohammed came down and told you to himself. For that, he was tortured and shot in front of his parents. British troops are training rebels who are doing things like that. They're training the rebels who last week hacked the head off a harmless middle-aged Catholic priest in Aleppo. We're training people like that. There's almost certainly, in addition to training them, actually what they call advisors, observers, forward troops, SAS men, fighting with the rebels against the Syrian army. That's our soldiers, the very, very best of the British army, and our money being used to pay for it, being involved in Syria and its next doors right now. It matters. David Cameron and William Hague have just announced, it's gone through almost unnoticed, they've announced within a couple of months British troops will be on the ground in Libya. Because otherwise Libya will fall to Islamist rebels. And we can't have that happening, can we? Except why are the Islamist rebels basically now in charge in Libya? Because Libya had another fairly harmless socialist dictatorship under Gaddafi. I went there many years ago. It was calm, it was peaceful, people were prepared to talk to you in the street, There weren't cops everywhere around. When people talked to you, they didn't look over their shoulders looking for the secret policeman. It struck me as a reasonably decent place, not somewhere I'd wanted to live. And yet, the form of government that Gaddafi imposed probably isn't the sort which would appeal to us. But what the hell's it got to do with us? So, the Tory government spent millions and millions and millions of pounds interfering, in fact billions, in Libya, and as a result, the old socialist dictatorship was swept aside, and instead you've got a mass of crazed Islamist fanatics, exactly the same as the ones who blew themselves up on our streets this time, 7/7, really not that long ago, 2005. Exactly the same. So, because having put those people into power, now Cameron is saying, oh, didn't realise that was going to happen. Now we've got to use the British Army in Libya. So they're going to be there within a couple of months. And if they destroy Syria in the same way, Syria will also fall completely into the hands of these Islamist fanatics. Whereupon Cameron or whoever succeeds him will then say, now we've got to go into Syria, because otherwise the Islamists will take over and they'll come and blow up Britain. It would be far easier to have left the Libyan sensible people to deal with the crazies and to leave the Syrian sensible people to deal with the crazies instead of interfering. And that's why it matters, because whenever they interfere in somewhere like Syria or Libya, there's a blowback, and in the end it comes back and it affects us. And it affects us first of all because in the end they have to send in British troops to try and stop the Islamists taking over completely, and the minute they're there, they're targets for those Islamists, and also for people who are just patriots in their own country who don't want to see foreign troops in their country. We can understand that, can't we? Even looking at Afghanistan, yes, we call them terrorists. Yes, they are terrorists. But who's in whose country? Well, actually, there's plenty of them in our country, aren't there? And they shouldn't be. They go back to their own country. But when it comes to military means, it's our soldiers in their army. What do you expect? But their people won't like it. When the Americans manage to use one of their drones and they spot a group of Pakistanis or Afghans sitting in a tent, and they say to themselves, oh, that's a terrorist council of war, splat it, and it turns out they killed another wedding party. What do you expect? That people turn against the Americans and us. It creates terrorism. And the more we're there, the worse it's getting. So the first thing is we shouldn't be there because it will cost our soldiers' lives, guaranteed. Because the minute we're there, the Islamists then can stop killing moderate Muslims and Christians and focus on the target they really want, which is Westerners, which is Brits. So we should get the hell out and stay the hell out of those places. It also matters because of money. Yeah, the lives of our soldiers are far more important. But every time we spend another £100 million on someone else's war, that's another raft of hospitals had to be shut, that's more nurses had to be sacked. It's our people die as an indirect but still immediate result of wasting that money because we haven't got enough money to go around. We can either fight foreign wars or we can have a health service. Which do we want? I know what I want. I know what my wife as a nurse wants. I know what those of you who have used hospitals are grateful to the health service, who may need to use hospitals. We all know what we want. It's only our ruling elite want war instead of hospitals. We'll look at why in a bit. The Libyan exercise, looking at, again, one more bit of facts of this. Immediately after the Libyan war, the government said, don't worry. In the run-up, they said, we're not going to get involved at all. It won't cost us anything. Don't believe that when a Tory tells you that. In the immediate aftermath, they said, well, we reckon it's cost £200 million to flatten Libya back into the 7th century. It's not the case. According to Defence Analysis, which is an independent organisation which looks at these things, the real cost is more than 7 times what Cameron told us it was going to be. The actual cost of destroying Libya and handing it over to 7/7 type crackpots was £1.75 billion. That's of our money, our taxes, that could have been spent on schools or hospitals or roads or tax cuts for the British people. Instead of that, it's been blowing up, destroying somebody else's country. It's quite literally criminal. The third reason we shouldn't be there, and the reason why it matters, and why we shouldn't get into Syria, is because it's counterproductive. There's a phrase called blowback, which first came out of Afghanistan, where when the Afghan rebels were fighting the Russians, the communists, the CIA and MI6, the Americans and the Brits, poured enormous amounts of money and training and weapons into the Afghan rebels to help destroy the Soviet Union, which of course it did. Job done. But then you got the blowback, because now they've got the training and the equipment and the confidence to say, well, actually, the Soviet Union was only the lesser of the two evils, and the United States is the great evil that we hate, as Muslims and so on in the world, so we'll destroy the United States. And the little puppet that trots along whenever the United States goes to war, Britain, thanks to our government. So you get blowback. As you probably know, most of you, I've not long returned from Syria, where in particular I interviewed one Syrian rebel, very strange character. He was a suicide bomber, failed, I hasten to add. Suicide bomber, 2-3 cars, and the first one went off and damaged him so much that he couldn't set his bomb off, so he wakes up in a hospital. Still alive and being well treated. He's got his arm pinned and so on. So, because he believed the propaganda about the Syrian armed forces under Assad being monsters who'd shoot their opponents, he actually came to the conclusion, well, I'm alive, I'm being treated, well looked after, they feed me 3 times a day, nice halal meals like you get in British hospitals, doing okay here. So he convinced himself he's still with the Syrian Free Army and not in the hands of the Syrian government at all. So I had to go along and pretend to be a volunteer jihadist from Britain who'd gone to see this hero of the Syrian Muslim revolution just to shake his hand and say hello. And because he thought that I and the people with me were Islamist extremists like him, he was quite happy to talk to us and spill the beans. So I asked him, well, when we win here, if you're well enough to fight by then, when we win here, where do we go then? And he immediately, no prompting, nothing, said, well then, we go on to attack Europe and attack America and take the whole of the world, because jihad, we've got to conquer the whole of the world for the jihad. So there you are, the people that Cameron and Haig and these other crazies or crooks are arming and training to fight a jihad want to come and fight jihad in Europe and in Britain. That's what's coming. And either they'll win that war, in which case they'll then have all the confidence and all the resources of the new Islamist Syria, which has quite a lot of oil and enormous amounts of gas, so then they'll have the money to come and attack us, or there'll be a stalemate and the war will go on for some years, in which case every month it goes by there'll be another little group of young Muslims leave this country from places like Manchester and so on, leave this country to go to Turkey, to go into Syria, to train with the rebels, to fight for a few months and come back as heroes of the jihad in their own community, and come back as 20, 21-year-olds with battle scars and half an arm or whatever. And then the 15, 16-year-old Muslims in their area will think of them as heroes, and every single one of them will be the nucleus of an Islamist terrorist cell which wants to die killing us. That's the mentality. And these are the people that we're going to be training if Cameron and co have their way. It is absolutely mad. They say we're going to give them small arms. They don't need small arms. They've got Kalashnikovs coming out of their ears. They've got no shortage of weapons, but they're short, for instance, of ground-to-air missiles. What a great idea, isn't it? How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you have gone through an airport in the last year? Show of hands? Well, there's a few, not that many actually. That's, I suppose, the impact of a grinding recession. Yeah, but still, anyone who's gone through an airport in the last few years, you know how you basically, well, you go through the scanners which visually strip search you, got to take your shoes off, got to take your belt off, got to be searched. If you're a white Brit, you're going to get searched. If you go through in a burqa, oh, come this way. I've never ever, I use airports a lot, I've never ever seen someone wearing a burqa being searched. No, that'd be disrespectful. That'd cause trouble. So they target the very people who aren't likely to blow themselves up on a plane, namely us, and they let walk through those who actually might blow themselves up on a plane. Crazy. But in any case, all that security at Liverpool Airport, all that security, what the hell is the point if they're giving Islamist crackpots ground-to-air missiles, which they can smuggle back through Turkey, smuggle back through into Britain, in the way that they smuggle vast amounts of heroin and cocaine into this country, and weapons and all sorts. They'll smuggle those through. Do you think it matters to someone who's prepared to die? Are they actually worried about the idea of getting caught at Dover with a rocket launcher and ending up serving 5 or 6 years in prison? It doesn't. It's not going to hurt them, is it? It's not going to bother them, because while they're in prison, they'll be recruiting and training other young Muslims. So they're quite happy. So there's no reason at all. If this British government sends one of our state-of-the-art ground-to-air missiles over to the Syrian rebels, there's no reason at all it won't end up back in Liverpool, pointing up at that airliner on its way to a holiday on the Costa del Sol, because that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. So it's absolute madness. That's another reason that we shouldn't be there. It's so counterproductive. So why are we there? Why are we going to be there? A few reasons. First of all, I fear it's very, very simple. Vanity. After Maggie Thatcher fought, the only good thing she did virtually was the war in the Falkland Islands. If she'd done the right thing and not pulled out the Antarctic Explorer, which was the British naval vessel which was there showing that we were still interested in the Falklands, if she hadn't pulled that out in defence cuts a few months before, the Argentinians would never have invaded in the first place. But that's a different matter. At least once that war was on, Thatcher did lead and won that war. But ever since that one, every single Prime Minister who's come along seems to think, oh, I'm Prime Minister now. First thing, we'll have a war. Yeah. And Blair strutted and preened on the world stage about Iraq, and I've no doubt at all that Cameron and people like Haig, they fancy themselves being in the history books. They don't want to be in the history books as the people who presided over yet a further downturn in this bankrupted country's bankrupt economy. They want to do something lively and fun and something that people will read about in years to come. So they have a nice war. So Cameron, in fact, he's had several wars. He's had the Libyan one already. Now he wants another war. So it's purely personal vanity for people who are in the elite. But it's only a very small amount of that. It's far more about money. Far, far more. And there's various groups in the world, very powerful interest groups, who want us involved in these wars. The first group, particularly in Syria, is the Saudi Arabians and the other Gulf states, people like Qatar and Bahrain. They want us in the war. Very simply, it's a religious war to them. It's a sort of civil war. There's a civil war going on in the whole of Islam between, in very simple terms, the hardline Sunnis, who are called Wahhabis or Salafists. No need to go into really what they're called. They're the people who say there's only one thing matters in Islam, and that's exactly what's said in the book, in the Quran. And you read that absolutely literally, and that's what you then rule your lives by. So it says, hate and fight the unbelievers, hate and fight the Christians, hate and fight the Jews. That's what we've got to do. But actually, there's a significant number of Muslims, there's other sects, and even quite a few moderate Sunnis, who look, and it is now, 1700 odd years old, that religion, getting on that way, and there's ones, they've added bits to it, they've interpreted it, and the interpretations have in some cases made it softer. And the people who run Saudi Arabia, who run the Gulf states, they say that that interpretation, that making it soft, it's heresy. It's got to be destroyed. They call it takfir, interpretation. And they hate the takfiris, the people who interpret and moderate the Quran, even more than they hate us, as if that's possible. They really hate them beyond anything else. So they've got this civil war, and they want, before they come and conquer us, which they intend to do, the people like the Saudi Arabians, before they Islamify our country completely, they also want to completely Islamify and turn to their own narrow sect the whole of all the rest of the Muslim world. And they particularly hate Syria, because again, I was astounded in Syria. You can walk around and there's all sorts of different mosques open, there's big churches open, there's priests and parishioners and so on, walking happily, freely to and from church and so on. It's quite a religious society. But there's dozens of different religions and sects, and they all get along fine. They really do. There's even people, there's women walking around, not dressed as big black crows, but dressed in the full hijab. And that is telling all the other Syrians that I support the people who are waging a rebellion against this state. And they're free to walk around the streets of Damascus. Imagine in the Second World War, someone being free to walk around the streets of Liverpool carrying a swastika flag. That's virtually it, because that's what that dress means. It means I'm a Wahhabist, I'm a Salafist, I want to destroy your horrible, evil, secular society and make you all obey our version of Islam absolutely to the letter. Quite remarkable that those people are free to walk about. But the Syrians are proud of the fact that they've got this very tolerant, in religious terms, very tolerant society. And that last tolerant society, where in particular the large Christian majority is still free, it's the last one in the Middle East. All the rest have already been destroyed. Iraq used to be like that until we went in and destroyed it. And now there's hundreds of thousands of Christians have had to flee Iraq or be killed. So it's refugees. Now, I've met those people, these actually moderate Muslims, these Shia, the Sufis, and the Syrian Christians. I've met and talked to them. They're really nice people. But I don't want them coming to Liverpool, because Liverpool is overcrowded and it's got enough poverty and enough problems of its own. We need to sort the problems of Liverpool out before importing other people from somebody else's war, somebody else's mess. So I want those people to stay in control of their own country, to have a peaceful and tolerant country. One, because it's a decent thing and they're nice people, but also because I don't want them here, because we can't afford to have them here. But that's part of it. The Saudi Arabians are running this civil war against their fellow Muslims and against Christians in the Middle East. Well, what effect does that have on Britain? It's about money. Because the Saudis are Britain's most important market for defence equipment, i.e. weaponry. They're worth billions and billions of pounds in this country. Because the Saudis and the Qataris and the Bahrainis, they've got so much oil wealth, they don't know what to do with it. So they're investing it, particularly in London. Every big new building, or every large old building that comes up for sale, you'll usually find Middle East and Gulf oil money flooding in there. It's not actually that much. You're talking about investment from Qatar of £5 billion. Remember what I said about the banks? We bailed them out to the tune of 500 billion. So they're 1/100th of what Britain has wasted blowing the banks, is what the government is saying. We really need this money, so we've got to be really nice to the Qataris and fight their wars for them. If you believe that, well, I've got a bridge down in London I can sell you, if you can afford it. That kind of money doesn't buy governments. Governments are bought because people get money in their back pockets. It's more blatant in France. France has come out saying, oh yeah, we've got to back the Qataris and the Saudis and destroy the current government in Syria. France has come out and said that, and that's because it's actually a matter of record that Qatar alone has just bailed out the French state to the tune of $15 billion, which is a lot of money, as a deposit, just a deposit, an advance payment on keeping up their credit ratings. So the French government has been bailed out by the Qataris, and word is that each of the French ministers involved has now got a Swiss bank account with tens of millions of dollars in it just for him. So they bought them. But of course you can't buy British politicians like that, can you? Oh yes, they've all been bought. Well, look at one of the lobbies I'm going to talk to in a little while, and you'll see, talk about in a little while, and you'll see that actually British politicians, they're usually bought, it doesn't cost tens of millions shoved into a Swiss bank account to buy a British politician. They're bought for donations of £2,000 or £3,000 or £5,000 from the people who want to buy influence in British politics. British establishment politicians are actually available absolutely on the cheap. But you bet your life that when the Saudis, there's no arms contract of that size goes through without fraud and backhanders. It's simple. That's what they do. There are people who are basically genetically inclined to trade camels, but now thanks to oil they've got the money to trade in billions and billions of pounds worth of contracts. And yes, they won't sign a contract unless they're getting backhanders, and they wouldn't accept a top politician, they expect a top politician to give them the contract, to give them these benefits, unless they in turn gave all sorts of nice presents. So the British powers that be have been bought, and because they've been bought, our air force has been bought, our taxes have been bought to go and flatten the poor bloody Syrians who are only trying to defend their own country. So that's part of it. It's not the only ones, it's not just the Saudis, oh no. Let's blame some other people who need blaming. WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, hugely rich Americans, running companies like Halliburton. Companies which, every time there's a war, Halliburton makes billions of dollars. Because although, just like in our armed forces, the boys and girls who do the fighting and the dying are still volunteers from mainly poor communities, just ordinary people, and they do the fighting and dying, and we as taxpayers pay for it. But the logistics, the supplies, the armaments, everything that goes behind it, the big trail that comes along behind an army, that's all privatised, especially in the United States. The whole, apart from the shooting end and the bayonet end, the whole of the American military, all the money inside is privatised. So Halliburton make billions when the Americans go in and flatten a country, and then they get the contracts to build it back up again. In the case of many of the most important contracts in Iraq, no one else in the world was even allowed to tender for the reconstruction contracts. We send our boys to fight and die, but British firms weren't even allowed to tender, to put in a bid for the main reconstruction contracts in Iraq in the oil fields. They went to Halliburton as of right. Not least because Dick Cheney, who at the time was the Vice President of the United States, was also the CEO of Halliburton. So you're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars go to very, very rich people to make them even richer every time we have a war. And these are the same people who decide we're going to have a war. The man who ran the Foreign Office operation to destroy Gaddafi, Alan Duncan, Tory MP and Cabinet Minister, he's got a long record of involvement with Vitol, which is the largest private oil trading company in the world. So the company he's involved with supplied oil and money to the Libyan rebels. He supplied the Air Force and our taxes to help the Libyan rebels win. And then at the end of the war, Vitol got the most important and valuable contracts to rebuild and to trade in Libyan oil. How corrupt is that? It's blatant, it's naked, it's in the newspapers. It's in the Guardian anyway, if you read the Guardian. It's all over the internet, it's all there, absolute facts. The whos and whys and whens of how our rotten, corrupt establishment is destroying other people's countries with our money, with our blood, and lining their pockets for doing it. It's all out there. It's an absolute scandal. But believe me, the Americans are far better at it, far bigger at it than the Brits. But because our politicians are convinced we have a special relationship with the United States, whenever they go to war, they drag us to war on their coattails. Except if this party were in charge, no way, like I say, we'll fight our wars, but we'd never use one drop of British blood to fight anybody else's war. That's a promise. I haven't finished there. A minor player in the conspiracy to destroy Syria is also Turkey, because Turkey wants to be a regional power. Syria used to be part of the Turkish Empire. They want it back. To do that, they want to turn it into a basket case. And these are the people who David Cameron and the Tory party think should be in the European Union. 80 million Turks, where the ones, a lot of them in Istanbul, they're actually very like us. They are quite westernised. They're actually quite a lot of, they look European. But if you look at the whole of eastern Turkey, Anatolia, you look at the vast teeming millions of Turkey, they're a Central Asiatic people. And they're Muslims, they're not European, they don't belong in Europe, no possibility. And if they do, it'll be importing another huge wave of poverty and ignorance and crime and oppression of women into a Western world, into a Britain, into a Liverpool that's already got enough of these problems. Absolute madness. But the Turks at present are the good guys, because they're on the same side as the Saudis and so on, because they have this same crackpot religious extremism, and there's various British companies want to trade with them and so on, so they all nudge Mr Cameron and so on, yeah, go along to what they want. Not finished there. Two other really important blocks dragging us into war. The first call themselves neocons, neoconservatives. Most of the Conservative cabinet are neocons, but there's nothing conservative about neocons. It's a sort of ideology way of looking at the world which came out of the United States in the late, really 1990s. These were people who were hardcore Trotskyite fanatics, hardcore communists in the 50s, 60s, but they turned against communism because the communists started to turn against Israel. And these people were hardcore communist Trotskyite Jews. I'm not saying all Jews, Are Trotskyites dangerous or anything? Absolute nonsense. I'm saying it's a small group of people in the United States who had several things in common. And what they had in common most of all was being hardcore communists and being Jewish zealots, Jewish extremists. In a way, if you like, in the eyes of some people out there, we're British extremists. Yeah? We are convinced that a lot of what matters in this country, a lot of what should be done, is about the overall wishes of the British people. We may be right, we may be wrong, but we don't speak for everyone, unfortunately, and not everyone else in Britain speaks for us. We're of Britain, but we're not the whole of Britain. Likewise, you can talk, or should be able to talk, about members of the Jewish race and what they do, that group, without it being said, oh, you want to kill all Jews. What absolute nonsense. It's propaganda bullshit, isn't it? But that's what we do. Because of that, we're not allowed to talk about these issues. Well, sod that. The issues need talking about because these people are trying to drag us into yet another war which will get hundreds of British boys and girls killed. So I don't want that to happen. We don't want it to happen. For it not to happen, you've got to understand why it's happening. So you have to talk about the neocons and the fact that this small group of Trotskyite extreme communist Jews turned against communism because it was anti-Jewish and set about instead remaking American capitalism so that it would serve their purposes, their interests. It would do what they wanted it to do. And that's what they set about doing. And the neocons developed enormous power. They have a lot of money. So, for instance, in the first set of elections where Obama got elected, now we're not very fond of Mr. Obama, in many ways. But they didn't want Obama to get elected because they thought he was a pacifist. They thought he was a dove who wouldn't go to war on what they wanted to do. So they spent millions and millions of dollars trying to stop Obama getting elected. And they failed. But they're now spending millions and millions of dollars trying to push Obama and America and Britain into a war which they want. Now, as a matter of fact, the only place in the world where this issue is freely discussed is Israel. Because Jews can talk about what other Jews are doing which is bad and wrong without being accused of being anti-Semitic. They're the only ones, or they usually are actually as well, but it doesn't quite stick. So what I'm saying now will be no news to anybody in Israel because there's a whole section of the Israeli left and sort of the civic society in the middle of, which is neither far left nor far right, not particularly religious. Whole sections of the Israeli body politic can discuss these things as Israeli newspapers, Israeli TV stations will show and talk about these things. But we're not allowed to. We're not allowed to. And as I say, we have to talk about them because the neocons are trying to involve us in these wars. They came up with a theory that it's really all for America, but for America to be big and strong needed several things. It had to contain or destroy a nationalist Russia and hand Russia back to the internationalists and to international capitalism, because Mr. Putin is taking it away from that and he's established a Russia which is in many ways nationalist, where Russia is run for the benefit of the Russian people. So they don't like that. The international banks don't like that. They want Russia run for the benefit of the international banks. So these people pouring money in to try to destroy Putin's Russia. That's one of the things they do. They also say that in order to be secure and strong, America has to have unlimited access to the world's energy, oil and gas, for the whole of this century. And therefore, it's worth fighting for. When you think about the $6 trillion they spent trying to secure oil in Iraq and a gas pipeline through Afghanistan, if they'd used that $6 trillion to develop alternative energy sources, to develop nuclear fusion, they wouldn't even need the Arabs' oil. You could leave it in the ground and leave them to go back to herding bloody camels. But no, they don't want to do that. They've got to seize it now. And one of the unfortunate things for the Syrians, they were already unpopular with the international powers that be, but recently they discovered huge amounts of gas under Syria and under the Mediterranean right the way across to Cyprus, which basically can't be exploited without Syria. And if the present government in Syria stays in charge, that gas will be exploited for the interests of the Syrian people. They'll sell it to us, but the profit will go to the Syrians. And the people in international big business, in international oil, they don't want that happening. They want the profit from that gas to go to them. So, therefore, Syria's got to go. And the other thing the neocons said is that, obviously, America has to side with Israel. Israel, right or wrong, whatever Israel does. Personally, I believe that there should be a homeland for the Jews. Logically, it's Israel. but by God, they've got to do something to establish some kind of peace with the Palestinians, whose land they've stolen in the first place. I think they should sort that out, but it's not up to us, it's up to them. If the Israelis think they can carry on oppressing the Palestinians and get away with it, well, I wouldn't send British troops to fight for the Palestinians. It's not our fight. I think they should reach an accord and reach a peace deal, but it's up to them. Similarly, if the Palestinians insist on every single inch of what was Palestine, they're not going to get it. They're entitled to say, we want it all, but logically and sensibly, I think they should reach a compromise. But it's not up to us. But the neocons say it is up to us. And the neocons say that Israel not only has to exist, but it has to expand, because these people are extremist Zionist fanatics, not just the ones who want Israel as it is. Their belief is that Israel will only fulfill its destiny, its messianic destiny, when it stretches from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is in the middle of what is now Iraq, because that's what it was in biblical times for a brief period. So they want the whole bloody lot, and they want in particular for now to force every last Palestinian still living in the occupied territories in Israel, they want to force them out. That's what they want to do. But to do that, they've basically got to have a worldwide war when the West will fight on behalf of Israel and won't care when the Israelis ethnically cleanse every last Palestinian from their shores, from their borders. That's what they want. Crazy, these people. If they were only in Israel, it wouldn't matter. But unfortunately, they're also here in Britain, so that when Tony Blair made the decision to go to war in Iraq, was that or was that not connected with the fact that even before he became Prime Minister, several senior members of this extremist, very, very rich Jewish milieu down in North London started giving Tony Blair the money which allowed him to become leader of the Labour Party. They funded his campaign to become Prime Minister. Now, does that or does that not have a probable effect on Tony Blair's later decisions in foreign policy terms? I would say it does. When now the papers are going wild about the fact that the Labour Party, having money from the trade unions, is in the pockets of the Labour Party, that's a logical deduction to make, isn't it? They get money from the unions, they need money to win elections, therefore they're beholden to the unions, therefore they do what the union leaders want them to do. Entirely uncontroversial. So now let me say what the Labour Party and the Tories have done. They've taken money from extremely rich Zionist businessmen living in Britain. They've used that money to get elected. Therefore, it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's exactly the same thing. And when I criticise the Labour Party for being in pockets of the unions, that doesn't make me anti-union, because I'm not. I'm a member of a trade union, Solidarity. I helped to create that union so that nationalists have a union which won't throw them out. I believe in trade unions. I'm not anti-trade union. But I criticise the leftist trade union leaders who are financing the Labour Party to destroy Britain, because that's what the Labour Party is doing every time it gets to power. And similarly, I feel entirely entitled, and this party feels entitled, to criticise the Labour Party and the Tory Party for taking money off Zionist businessmen and then using our soldiers and our Air Force and our money to fight Zionist wars. It doesn't make me anti-Jewish. I'm just stating a fact. And the sooner these facts can be openly stated and understood, the sooner the real crazy extremes of anti-Semitism which are out there will fade away. Because once you can talk about a thing openly and sensibly, then there's not a conspiracy, and then you know what is fact and what is fiction, and you can get on and actually make decisions which suit this country and suit the peoples of the world, including, as a matter of fact, the very large block of ordinary Jews living in Israel and living in Britain who don't want to exterminate every last Palestinian, who don't want to have this greater Israel that stretches from the Nile to the Euphrates. They just want to get on in peace and practice their religion as we want to get on in peace, and either practice our religion or not practice it, because we're not religious at all, depending on as you are. But they're a problem. One last thing that these people want. Yes, they want to cleanse Palestine, but they also, both the neocons and the Zionists, they've got a bigger agenda. They want to take out Iran for several reasons. Syria and Iran have financed and trained Palestinians who are fighting to get at least a part of their country back. So they feel if they can take them out of the frame, Syria and Iran, they can deal more easily with the Palestinians. They can oppress them and kill them and no one will care, and they won't be able to fight back. But they also want to take Iran out because Iran is not only a regional threat to Israel and an even bigger threat to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis want to take Iran out because they've got two different versions of Islam, so it's this same old civil war business. But there's also amongst the neocons a slightly strange concept called geopolitics, which in very, very simple terms, they, for some bizarre reason, I've never yet worked out what it is, they believe that the southern parts of Russia, what's basically now places like Turkestan, Tajikistan, Absurdistan, for all I know, there's something special about those. They are the sort of, if you look at a map in terms of where the land mass of the world is, it's sort of centred around those places. And therefore they convince themselves it's really important that you seize control of those places. Some of the Nazis had a similar bonkers idea. That's one of the reasons, apart from oil, that Hitler invaded and went into southern Russia. Whoever holds that part of the world controls the world. It's like playing an enormous game of Risk, except they're using real money and real boys' and girls' lives to do it. But they actually think there's something really important. And if you look at the map, if the Syrian domino falls, the Iranian domino falls, and then all the Caucasus and the southern parts, and all of a sudden the West, which isn't the West at all, it's these neocon crackpots and companies like Halliburton, they're there at the underbelly of Russia, and they're there in this central part of Asia, which for some reason is really important. I don't think it's important at all. As far as I know, it's a fly-blown wilderness. It's nothing like as important as Liverpool is to me. I don't give a damn about what happens over there, but these people do. And because they do, they want to knock over Syria, to knock over Iran, because they want to knock over Central Asia, and then they want to knock over Russia. And that's what these people are doing. And that's really very, very important. So Syria does matter. It matters directly to us for those reasons. It matters for several other reasons as well. The Syrians are fighting our war. They are fighting Wahhabi extremism. And when the Saudis aren't funding that war, they also fund the spread of their Islam into Britain. Most of the Muslims who came here, it was very unwise to let them in, but when they came here in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they were sort of Muslim, a lot of them in the way that we are sort of Christian. Most of them weren't particularly strong about it. They came here to get better life for their kids in a Western country. No one can blame them for that. It's the politicians' fault for letting them in, not their fault. They came here to get a better life. They weren't particularly religious. But since the 60s, the Saudis have poured billions of dollars into the Muslim communities in the West, in Britain, in France, Denmark, places like that, to turn them into hardcore radicals. 70% of the mosques in Britain are financed by Saudi Arabia. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. So if they're financing the mosque, they're appointing the imam. They're saying what he preaches. And he won't be preaching the tolerant bits of the Quran. He's preaching hatred of us and the destruction of our society in 70% of the mosques in Britain. And so when the Syrians stand up to that kind of extremism, they're actually fighting our war for us. There's another reason as well. And this is perhaps more for the old hands in the audience as opposed to the newcomers. We're fighting in this country not just because there's a bit of a problem with asylum seekers or Polish plumbers. Those are just symptoms. We are fighting for a revolution in this country to absolutely transform the way this country is governed and run, so it's a nationalist state run by its people, for its people. Not just the people here now, but for future generations as well. We're fighting for something which overturns the whole of the way the present system is run, where it's all about money, 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 now, now, now. We're fighting for something absolutely different, where our community, our identity, our existence, our freedoms are more important than money. It's a huge turnaround. It is not just a change of government. It's a revolution, not just in who's in charge, it's a revolution in here, amongst all our people, and in here as well. It's something far, far bigger. It's an all-transcending revolution that we're fighting for. And I can tell you that a nationalist revolution in one country cannot survive. The Syrians effectively had a national revolution, and you see what's happening to them. We can only have our revolution and sustain our revolution against the world banks, against the far left, against the Islamist crazes, against the Zionists, against everyone who wants to tear it down, everyone who wants to destroy what we do. and go back to having a society run for their vested interest. We can only sustain our revolution if there's other countries have the same kind of revolution. In particular, unless either America or Russia, the two still great white superpowers of the world, unless one of them is on side with national revolutions, then they will be squished out like that. They'll go. So it's really important. Yes, when we're out campaigning on the streets, we're campaigning for something like keeping open a local park. We're campaigning to raise money, as per the thing that Mike suggested, the Santa Project. We're campaigning to raise money to give pensioners at Christmas time a food hamper. We're campaigning in small ways, small things, to help our people at a local level. But those campaigns are something far, far bigger, literally an effort to remake the world so that free nations of free people like the British, like the French, the Germans, the Syrians, everybody can say, right, this is the most important thing. Our country, for our people, without oppressing anybody else, because we're going to get on and make our part of the world a better place. You're not allowed to do that in the modern world. It's revolutionary. And so we have to stand by Syria, because if Syria goes, Iran goes, Russia goes, and there's no hope then for a little country like Britain, and we are now a little country, a bankrupted country. There's no hope for us having a revolution unless we have friends who are on the same wavelength in country after country all over the world. And that is why I went to Syria. That's why I'll go back to Syria. That's why I'll do whatever I have to do in Syria, because their fight is our fight. And this fight is something really worthwhile. Let me leave you with this, saying I was told many years ago. Actually, I was told a cruder version, but I won't, because there's ladies present and a camera. So the sanitised version is everybody's born, everybody eats, everybody dies. If you don't have a purpose in life, that's it. You're born, you eat, you die. You do a few other things in between times, and that's it. You're just another piece of human cattle, unless you have a real purpose in life. And I ask you, the people here in the audience, the people watching this, I ask you to make up your minds now to have a real purpose in life, to commit yourself, dedicate yourselves. Yes, keep on with your family, your education if you're young, keep on with all those things, but additionally, dedicate yourself to being part of this global struggle for the rights of all peoples all over the world to be free and to run their own affairs in peace and genuine harmony, and to celebrate their own traditions, their own ways of being human. Commit yourselves to that, because everybody else is born and they eat and they die. But there's a few of us, a happy few, a band of brothers and sisters. We do more than that. We're also here, the few who make history, the few who change history, the few who are going to save Britain. And I want you to be with me as part of that few. Thank you. Really, I'd like to go and have your few questions. Yeah, of course.